Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charged. Today we're taking a look at apologetics with Dr. Alister McGrath. Dr. McGrath is a Northern Irish theologian, Anglican priest, intellectual historian, scientist, Christian apologist, and public intellectual, as well as being emeritus professor of science and religion at the University of Oxford. He holds 3 doctorates from Oxford and is the author of over 50 books, including the book we're taking a look at today, Christian Apologetics, an Introduction. Follow the link below to check it out. So, Dr. McGrath, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, it's great to be with you. Thank you very much for having me.
So, you've been one of my biggest intellectual heroes for years, so I'm very honored to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So, now that you're retired, are you going to pursue a 4th doctorate?
No, I've got lots of things to do. Write more books, give more talks, so I'm very happy.
Okay. So if you could give the audience an idea of your background theologically and ecclesially, as well as just give a general idea of what your focus was for each of your 3 doctorates.
Yeah, sure. Well, I used to be an atheist when I was a teenager, and then I discovered Christianity when I was a student at Oxford. When I was a scientist then. I did a first degree in chemistry, then a first doctorate in an aspect of biology. And really discovering Christianity at Oxford made a huge difference to me, and made me realize that actually maybe I could help people who, like me, had been atheists become Christians as well. So, if you like, the seeds of being an apologist were beginning to be planted in my mind. I went on to do other doctorates in systematic theology and in intellectual history. But in many ways, I'm someone who is fascinated by Christianity, thinks it's wonderful, and see it as my vocation, really, to explain this, to defend it, to try and get people interested in it and see why it's so attractive and why it's able to change life so dramatically. So that's really where I'm coming from.
And your church background?
Well, I'm a minister in the Church of England. I don't actually practice ministry anymore because I'm so busy giving talks. But certainly my heart is very much in ministering to people, and I see apologetics as a very important part of the ministry of the church.
And so you've always been, your only church background has always been Anglican then?
That's right, yes.
Okay, but could you say a little more detail about what your theses were about for your doctorates?
Well, when I was doing my first doctorate in molecular biophysics, I was really looking at how some of the mechanisms which allow the release of ephedrine into the bloodstream, which is very, very interesting. We didn't solve it, but it was very, very interesting. For my second doctorate in systematic theology, I was really looking at aspects of the doctrine of justification, which is something that really excites me, looking particularly at its history, its historical development, and its contemporary significance. And then intellectual history, I was really looking at the historical interaction of science and religion. So I got quite a wide range of interests here, but all of them, I think, feed into my interest in trying to explain Christianity, especially in the scientific culture.
All right. And so if you could give the audience just a general idea of your approach to apologetics, and particularly the 3 core elements that you focus on.
Well, that's right. I mean, my approach to apologetics in general terms is to break down barriers, to try and help people to see that things that maybe they thought were problems actually aren't really all that problematic. But I think the 3 key areas I think it's good to talk about are defending, explaining, and translating. Defending, well, that's really saying, look, people very often have good questions to ask about Christianity. They have worries, but actually we can talk about these things. And actually, when you look at them, they aren't as significant as you might think they are. And very often people feel they have to reject Christianity because you can't prove it to be true, but then they begin to realize, well, you can't even prove that atheism is true. The problem really is that whatever really matters lies beyond absolute proof. So defending Christianity is very, very important. But the second point I try to make is that explaining Christianity is really important as well, because a lot of people just don't really understand what Christianity actually is. And therefore, to be able to explain it's really important. In my own case, one of the things that stopped me coming to faith in Christianity as a younger person was I had all these kind of misunderstandings about what it was about. And when people began to explain to me, look, this is what Christianity really is, well, that changed everything. So explaining Christianity I mean, for me, in many ways, very often the best defense of Christianity is simply a good explanation of it. But then we come to a third element, which is translating. And this really means trying to talk about Christianity in a language that people can understand. Because the problem is that as Christians, we very often talk about very important ideas like redemption or atonement or incarnation, but these don't really connect up with our wider culture. We need to say, here's what we mean by these words. And that's about translating. That's very, very important for C.S. Lewis. We need to translate our ideas into the cultural vernacular. And that's a very important part of apologetics.
So there's some categories like evidentialist or presuppositionalist. Are there any of those labels that apply to you?
I think I have a very broad approach to apologetics, which means at times I will use presuppositions approach. I think they're very, very useful. At times I'll use more evidentialist approaches. At times I'll use more experience-based approaches. But they're all part of this wonderful thing we call apologetics. And there are many different approaches we can take, and each of them has their own distinct strengths.
All right. So you talk about Richard Swinburne and his inference to the best explanation, and you particularly address it in regard to Dawkins' claim that, or demand, that Christians prove the existence of God.
Well, that's right. Dawkins seems to have this very outdated scientific positivism, which is you have to prove everything you believe. But Richard Swinburne rightly makes the point that in the philosophy of science, we're talking about finding the best explanation, realizing that very often you can't prove it's right, but you can show it's better than the alternatives. So in many ways, inference to the best explanation is about lining up possibilities, looking at each of them, and saying, here's why I think this one is the best. You might think of C.S. Lewis's chapter in Mere Christianity, talking about the Christian hope, where he says, look, I have to explain this observation. I have this deep yearning for something that nothing really satisfies. Maybe it's just impossible to do anything about this. Maybe I'm looking for the wrong thing, or maybe I'm really created to relate to God. And Lewis says it's that third explanation which is the best. So I think it's a very important approach for apologetics. We don't need to prove that we are right. We need to show that our approach is better than the alternatives. That's a very important point, I think.
So when people would challenge Dawkins then, okay, you're demanding that Christians prove God or theists prove God, but can you prove atheism? What was his response to that sort of
Well, he gets very angry about this because in many ways, one of the things I discovered as an atheist was I couldn't prove there was no God. And actually, I think every intelligent person knows that that is true. Whether you're an atheist or a believer in God, you can't absolutely prove that you are right. It's a faith, if you like. And that's one of the things that I think people realize more and more about atheism. Atheism is a commitment. There is no God. As a Christian believer, I believe there's a God. When I was an atheist, I believed there wasn't a God, but I couldn't prove it. I think that's a very important point to help people see that even atheism is actually a belief system. It's a belief there is no God, and that can't be proved to be right.
So I was reading recently by some Christian philosopher who's making the statement that ultimately our arguments or truth claims about this sort of thing that we can't prove, we ultimately use circular reasoning. Would you agree with that statement?
I certainly see that in Richard Dawkins' approach, that very often his arguments for atheism are very, very circular. In other words, you begin by presupposing your conclusion. And Dawkins very often will say, well, look, only science can answer life's big questions. And when I challenge him on how do you know that's true, well, he gets quite angry because we all know it's simply a circular argument. He presupposes the authority of science to demonstrate the authority of science. So I think it's very interesting to begin to deconstruct some of these arguments we find within the atheist community, because very often they are circular. And sometimes as Christians, we have to be careful we don't end up doing the same thing.
So you would say circular reasoning is never justified?
And it's always helpful to show that things are consistent. And that's why circular reasoning can be useful. But sometimes you need to break out of that circle and be able to show that actually there's a real connection here with reality, not simply the inner dynamics of an argument.
All righty. So you spend some time with points of contact and list 6 of them. So if you could define what a point of contact is, then go into some detail about each of those 6.
Well, point of contact is really something that isn't really part of the Christian faith. It's just something we observe or something we experience, but they can be like doors. They can be things that we open and they help us to begin to find our way to faith. And so I talk about 6 of these. There are lots more, but these are just the 6 obvious ones to look at. One of them is a sense of longing. That's very important for C.S. Lewis. He says, look, many people have this sense of longing for something that really satisfies and can't find what it's pointing to. And Lewis's argument is that actually this is, if you like, God prompting us, God saying, look, you haven't found something deeply satisfying, and that's because you haven't found me. That in effect, the human longing for something that really satisfies is really a disguised yearning for God. So that's a very helpful way of beginning to talk to some people about God as the fulfillment of our heart's desire. It's very, very significant for a lot of people. Or again, others have a real sense of amazement or wonder at the beauty of our world. Sometimes people see the night sky, they're overwhelmed by it, or they see the beauty of a landscape, and they really feel there's something deeply significant here, but we don't know what it is. And of course, the idea is the beauty of nature, which God created, is also a pointer to the beauty of God. And so we can begin to, in effect, use the beauty of nature as a way of getting people to think about what God might be like. And that's very, very helpful because there are many people, especially in North America, who have a deep sense of connection with nature and be able to say, look, you can get to know the guy who's behind this. That's really a very exciting line of apologetic thinking. But a third point of contact would be the ordering of the world, the fact that it's so obviously regular, it makes sense. And again, it didn't have to be like that. It could have been chaotic. But the key point for Christians is there's an ordering in the world, which of course reflects God as its creator. And therefore, the regularity of the world invites us to ask, why is it regular? And of course, again, you can see there's an argument there that leads to order as something that God brings to the created order and points to the existence of God. Or we might look at this idea of wonder, which I touched on a moment ago. Wonder is a sense of amazement at the beauty or the immensity of the natural order. And that's a very significant experience because a lot of people have this feeling that there's something out there. Not sure what it is, but they know there's something there. They know it's significant. And actually, when you begin to explore this, it's a pointer to God. So you might think of Psalm 8, which is all about the heavens declaring the glory of God. That's a very important line of argument. And that brings me into my next argument, which is that actually the night sky can really, be a very, very powerful way of opening up, thinking about God. Then another thing, which I think is a point of contact, is a sense of moral obligation. And C.S. Lewis talks about this right at the beginning of Mere Christianity, this sense that we ought to do something, that certain things are right, certain things are wrong. And Lewis's point is very simply, well, where's that coming from, and what does that point to? And again, Lewis is really saying this opens windows. This is, in effect, helping us to see there is something that needs to be explained, that this sense that there is right and wrong only really makes any sense if there is a transcendent reality, and that, of course, is God. And then, of course, there's also something a bit more negative, and that is a sense of existential anxiety and alienation. And many people know this, a sense of deep unease, a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of, what's the point of life? It's where people very often feel they are really, really in a very bad place and want to know, is there some hope? Can we make sense of things? And again, that's a very important way of beginning to talk about Christianity. Christianity brings hope to those who are experiencing this deep sense of hopelessness, of alienation, a sense that life just doesn't make sense at all. And being able to show how God brings meaning and significance is really significant. So what I'm saying really is there are lots of these points of contact. They begin conversations, they open doors, they're really very, very helpful in doing apologetics.
So back to the first one, the sense of longing for God. I think I've got this right, that Plantinga says that we're created with this sensus divinitas, right? But I heard another Christian philosopher critique that and say, well, it's not so much a sense for God that we're born with, but a sense for the transcendent or the mysterious. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, if you take a purely neutral way of describing, in other words, you're not making any assumptions that there is a God, then you could talk about a sense of transcendence. In other words, there's something bigger beyond the world. But of course, you can see how that easily maps onto the Christian understanding of God. So in effect, you can talk about moving from a sense of transcendence to a sense of the presence of God. So we have to do a little bit of work there to make that transition, but you can certainly make that transition very easily.
So I'm thinking about Karl Barth and what he would say about points of contact. And of course, he was an opponent of natural theology. So, and he was not known as an apologist per se, but when we bring Barth into the argument, what or points of correlation. I'm thinking about Tillich. He was big into
Well, Barth, I think, would
correlation.
say, really, there are no points of contact. That actually revelation makes its presence felt. That actually, we just allow revelation to happen. And I think that I accept as a very important point being made there. I also accept Barth's point that in many ways, the best apologetics is a good systematic theology. I think that that's right. But I still think we need to bear in mind the people we are talking to, where very often we have to help them get to a certain point where they can recognize that God is revealing himself. In other words, it may not be self-evident to them. We have to try and help them to make that intellectual connection, which allows them to see, for example, a sense of transcendence as actually God's self-disclosure. It's a very important thing for us to do, is to help them make that step.
Okay, so Barth had very particular reasons for rejecting points of contact that had to do with social, political realities.
Yes, in many ways, it's all to do with the political, intellectual environment of the 1930s, the rise of Nazism. And Barth was rightly worried that if you just left human reason to its own devices, it would end up in some very bad places. And he's right about that.
Okay, so narrative apologetics. So what is it? What are your key thoughts on it?
Well, narrative apologetics is saying, telling stories is really helpful apologetically. And I mean, if you look at scripture itself, there are stories everywhere. It's a very, very natural human way of speaking. I think one of the points that we need to emphasize is that very often arguments only take you so far. But if you tell your own story, the story of how I discovered Christianity, or the story of how Christianity transformed my life, then that is based on an argument. But actually, it's really talking about the transformation of somebody's life. And when you're talking about how your life is transformed, you're telling your story. I think narrative apologetics is very, very important for us because many people have stories to tell, stories about how they discovered faith, stories about the difference that faith made to them. I think it's very important to say to ordinary people who are listening to me, you have a story to tell. It may be a story about how you discovered God. It may be a story of how your faith grew. But the key point you're making is that Christianity is not simply true in your view, it's also real. It has the capacity to change people's lives. And, I think we need people to think about that. So for me, narrative apologetics is really helpful because it connects with people very, very well. And it also invites us to tell our own stories of faith and let these connect up with the audiences that we're talking to.
Okay, I wonder how that narrative in terms of bigger picture, like telling the stories of various church movements or individual saints throughout the ages.
Well, you can certainly point to some very significant individuals and tell their stories, or indeed some very significant movements. I think that's a very fair point to make. I think that really the apologist has to figure out what are the best stories to use and how can we use them? Sometimes it's a biblical story, like, for example, the parable of the prodigal son. That's a beautiful example of an apologetic parable. Or you might say, well, actually, I can tell my own story. Or you can perhaps find, if you're talking to a secular audience, a secular novel and tell its story and say, do you see how this actually points us in the direction of divine grace? So what I want to say to listeners is, there are lots of things you can do with stories, and I strongly encourage you to find a way, find out what they are and what might work best for you.
One more thing, going back to points of contact and the ordering of nature. Since you are a scientist, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the fine-tuning argument, what it is, and then why, what you really think of it.
Well, the fine-tuning argument is that there are certain things about our universe that we now know are really quite astonishing. We now know, for example, that what we call the fundamental constants of the universe seem to be, well, fine-tuned is the right word, to allow life to come into existence. Now, it didn't have to be like that, but they are like that. What does that mean? Well, one answer might be simply, it means nothing. It's just the way things are. Get used to it. But if you're a Christian apologist, you want to say, no, this is really significant. This is completely what we would expect if we're talking about the Christian God and the way in which the Christian God brought things into existence. So in many ways, what I'm saying is the argument for fine-tuning doesn't prove anything, but it is deeply suggestive and opens up some really interesting conversations, which I think we need to have about why the world is the way it is. Is it just random, or was it made like that? And again, that's a really important conversation to have, I think.
So what are some of the constants you're talking about, and what sort of numbers are we talking about in terms of odds? Or
well, there are a number of constants. Some of them determine, for example, the way the universe expanded. Some of them about the way in which atomic particles stay close together. Some of them are about gravity. But the key point is that if these had been different, then the universe wouldn't have formed, life wouldn't have existed. And in fact, a very, very small change in any of these constants, like in the fine gravitational constant, would actually have quite a big impact on the way in which the universe emerged. So what I want to say is, don't overemphasize this, but there's something really significant here. This needs to be explained. One answer might be, hey, it's just random. The other is, well, this is exactly what you'd expect if Christianity is right in its thinking about the nature of God and the act of creation.
so in terms of some of those numbers, if it's a small amount that would change it, how small? I mean, to give people an idea of what sort of numbers
we're talking about fractions of a percent, really, really small. They make a huge difference. And it's not just one constant, it's all of them. So in effect, what you have is a whole series of interacting constants, and a very, very small change, less than 1% in one of them, would actually mean the world, the universe would be very, very different, and we wouldn't be here having this conversation. So it's a really interesting area of discussion.
So what do you think, with, say, a skeptic or an atheist, best argument would be? Because those scientists would acknowledge that those numbers are there, but how would they respond?
Well, most scientists would say you're absolutely right. This is a phenomenon. This is a real observation. The question is, what does it mean? And I think that what we'd have to say is, look, it doesn't prove, but can you see it fits in very well the Christian way of thinking? And one of the key things to do is to show people how Christianity, if we can't show it's right, it actually fits in so well with what we observe in the world around us and what we experience within us. So it's a very helpful starting point for some very interesting conversations.
Okay. And so then you deal with several objections, particularly how to tackle the notion that enlightenment, rationalism, through enlightenment rationalism, reason has displaced God. So how would you answer that?
Well, that's certainly a very common objection. Certainly in the 18th century, there are many people who say, look, reason can tell us everything. We don't need God. But we don't think like that anymore. Here are some reasons why. Number one, it's quite obvious that human beings reason in different ways, in different contexts. The idea of the Enlightenment, that there's some universal way of reasoning that's independent of history and culture, is just, it's just not taken seriously anymore. So we have to realize that human beings can be rational in different ways. And so this idea there's only one way of being reasonable is really part of history now. So I think that's a very important point to make. And another point, which is very, very significant, and those of you who are listening to me who are scientists will know about this anyway, is that the human sense-making apparatus within us is much more complex than reason. It's emotion, it's intuition, it's imagination. All of these things are interconnected. And that's one of the reasons why apologetics needs to be able to engage all these wide ranges. So I think the Enlightenment said, reason proves everything. People nowadays would say, no, it doesn't. It simply doesn't. But what Christianity is able to do is show that things make sense and also give us a reason for realizing why they make sense. In other words, explaining and showing why we can explain. Those are two very interesting points.
So you include an interesting quote from Chesterton about rationalism actually not being reasonable. I can't remember what it was, but...
Well, what Chesterton says is really interesting. He says, the moment you accept something that reason can't fully embrace, in other words, a mystery, like, for example, the existence of God, then suddenly everything becomes rational. What you're looking for is the crucial insight, which once you accept it, it suddenly makes the intellectual landscape light up and you can see it. C.S. Lewis makes a very, very similar point. And that's why, we need to talk to people about the difference that Christianity makes to the way we think about things, the way we see the world, and how that actually can be a very important way of talking about the difference faith makes and also why we might think it's right.
All right. Then another objection you have, which you've written several books about, the assumption that science and religion are ultimately incompatible.
Well, that's a very influential way of thinking. Richard Dawkins is a very good example of someone who thinks like that. But there are several big problems with this. Number one, this viewpoint really only emerged during the 19th century, the late 19th century. Number two, it's obvious if you look at the history of the relation of science and faith that actually science emerges from faith. It emerges from the belief the universe is rational, we can make sense of it, and that's a very Christian idea. What I'd say is there are basically three ways of thinking about the relation of science and faith. There's a Richard Dawkins approach that science and faith just contradict each other. Well, I don't think that's right at all. I mean, science may help us understand how our universe functions, but we need to understand what it means. And that's a different kind of knowledge. And Dawkins doesn't really seem to get that particular point. So he would say science and religion are at war with each other. I think that's historically nonsense. And actually, it's not the way most scientists think about faith. Or you can say, like Albert Einstein. Einstein said, look, science and religion are really, really important, but they're different. They are different aspects of our lives. Keep them apart. They're in different silos, if you like. And I respect that, but I want them to have a conversation. I don't see why they shouldn't have a conversation. And so the third viewpoint would be somebody like me who would say, so look, science and religion are great, but they can talk to each other. They can illuminate each other. They can actually help each other go further. It's a bit like, having a set of spectacles. You have two lenses, and when you look through two lenses rather than one, you get a stereoscopic vision. I think that's really important to say. In my own case, as a former scientist myself, what I find is that science is really helpful in showing me we've got an ordered universe and helping me to make sense of how things function. But I need more than this. I want to know what things mean. I want to know what I mean. And for that, you need a different kind of lens. And Christianity gives you that lens, which helps you to understand how you can live meaningfully in this world. And science can't do that. Science can't do meaning, it can't do ethics, but Christianity can in a very big way.
And then you tackle the notion of materialist reductionism, the idea that humans are just nothing but a collection of atoms.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I mean, materialism is a very I do. It's nonsense. I mean, again, I was. Well, I've got a glass. Look at this. Here's a glass of water. Okay. Now listen. This glass is made up of atoms and molecules, and so am I. Does that mean the glass and I are on the same level? No, no. The key point here is, look, we're all made of the same stuff, but we're different. And it's a purely reductionist account of human nature, which fails to do justice to what is so distinctive about human beings. Sure, we're all made of the same basic stuff, but what's really interesting is the way in which human beings differ from glasses of water or clouds in the sky. There's something distinct about us. And Christianity is really good in helping us understand what it is about human nature which makes it stand out. We have this ability to relate to God, to discover meaning, to discover goodness, and to change life, to live in hope of eternal life. So the idea that we are simply atoms and molecules is nonsense. Yes, we are made up of atoms and molecules, but we are so much more than that. We are able to, in a way, look at the night sky and say, this is wonderful. We make sense of it. And it points us to something much more significant that brings us meaning and hope. So there's a lot to say about that very inadequate way of thinking about human beings.
Well, how about the notion of the human soul? I know there's say, I guess it's Joel Green and a bunch of folks at Fuller, are evangelicals who say there is no distinct soul. We are atoms, but yet there is life after death, and we will be reconstituted somehow. And others will say, no, there's a traditional view of the immaterial soul. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there are different ways of thinking about this. What we need to say very, very clearly is there's something distinct about human beings which sets us apart from the rest of the created order. And actually, each of us has an individual identity which is important to us and important to God. And so the traditional idea of the soul makes this point very, very well. But if you have difficulties with that, there are other ways you can begin to find to maintain the key point, which is I am distinct, I'm unique, as is everybody listening to this program, and each of us has our own distinct relationship to God, and that's really important. But you can think of it in terms of personal relationships. For me, the idea of the soul makes an awful lot of sense. It's about there being something distinct, eternal about us, and that really is important. But we can talk about this and look at different ways, but the really important point is God made us, each of us is distinct, each of us is made to relate to God, and in some way Christianity makes that happen and brings us joy and fulfillment.
All right then. And so you address several individuals. You talk a lot about Chesterton throughout the book, but what do you like about him? What's important about him as an apologist?
Well, I love G.K. Chesterton. Let me tell you why. First of all, he's a journalist. And that means he writes very, very engagingly. So you read his orthodoxy, or you read some of his essays, and you just think that's so well done. He really makes it memorable. If you want to look at one of his essays, look at The Return of the Angels. Again, The Return of the Angels. You can find it on the web free, and it's beautifully written. It's about how Chesterton rediscovered his faith. It's beautiful. It's brilliant. And when you read that, you just say, this guy knows how to express himself beautifully. So Chesterton's got lots of good ideas, but he really knows how to use the English language. He's great.
But what are his key thoughts then about his approach?
Yes, his approach basically, I suppose, is Christianity offers a hypothesis. If you believe in God, everything else makes sense. So go and check that out. And what Chesterton does is to show how belief in God makes sense of our world and makes sense of our lives. And he does it very, very well. As you probably know, Chesterton wrote detective novels, and detective novels are about making sense of things. And Chesterton sees Christianity as making sense of life. So you can see there's a very interesting connection there.
All righty. And C.S. Lewis then. Yes, you keep going back to Lewis throughout the book also. So, of course, he's one of the greatest apologists. And what is really foundational about him?
Well, Lewis is very, very important for me personally because when I discovered Christianity when I was about 18 years old, I tried to grow in my faith, but there were questions I couldn't really answer. And then eventually I discovered C.S. Lewis. And Lewis showed me that there were answers. He gave me answers, and he helped me to develop my own thinking. And Lewis was really an enormously important figure in helping me to develop my own faith. And I think he helps others as well. He's very, very good at explaining the reasonableness of faith. He's very, very good at talking about how we have a sense of longing that leads to God. And he's brilliant in terms of using the English language to help us to see how Christianity is able to change life enormously. He's my favorite apologist, and I keep reading him. I always discover something I missed the last time round. He's really interesting.
What could you say more about his philosophy of apologetics?
Well, Lewis's philosophy of apologetics is really that people need to be helped, if you like, to step inside the Christian way of thinking and seeing things and experience the quality of its vision of the world. In other words, it's not really about arguing. It's much more, look, can you see the difference Christianity makes? Step into that way of thinking, look at the world through its eyes. Do you see the difference it makes? Trying to get them to realize this makes sense. This is very exciting. So if you like, although Lewis is very, very good at arguing, he's very, very good at making sense of things, his real argument is Christianity is a new way of seeing things. And once you step inside it, well, everything is different. Everything makes sense.
So what would you say are his most important apologetic works?
In Lewis's case,
Yes.
I think his Mere Christianity is probably one of the best works of apologetics. And certainly, I keep going back to that. It's very, very well written. It's very accessible. It's based on a series of talks he gave on BBC radio during the Second World War. And he reworked them, and they are extremely accessible and extremely engaging. Lewis is able to talk to ordinary people using ordinary language and make connections between their thoughts, their lives, their experiences, and the Christian faith. It's a remarkable book.
All righty. And you also picked Dorothy SARS, the
Well, I
author.
do, yes. She's really interesting. I mean, it's always good to have a woman apologist. She's very, very good. Again, she's a detective novel writer. She was very, very influential during the 1930s, along with Agatha Christie and people like that. And she argued that Christianity makes sense of our world. And she sees that as being absolutely essential, that in effect, the world is studded with clues to God's existence, to the significance of life, and that we need to discover this by reflecting on these clues and see what the bigger picture is. So if you like, Dorothy Sayers is saying that there is a big picture of life, and we can find it. And it leads us to God. And the gospel narratives and Paul's letters and experience of the world around us are all part of this way of finding the key to the meaning of life. So if you like, she's a detective novelist and an apologist at the same time.
So did she write anything then that was more specifically apologetic?
She gave a lot of lectures. For example, Creed and Chaos, a very famous one. But I think that one of the most interesting books that she wrote is to do with the fact that we bear God's image, and therefore we end up, if you like, thinking in ways that betray our divine origins. And it's this idea of human beings bearing the image of God. And that means, if you like, we have a homing instinct within us, which eventually is going to bring us home to God. So she's very, very interesting in that way. And she very often talks about her own experiences of a novelist, about making sense of things, and says that that really helps to understand how God tries to help us to realize he's there by making sense of the world.
Okay, yeah, we keep having the theme of making sense of the world.
Exactly.
It's not proof, but it's the best possible explanation. It ties
Exactly
everything
right.
together. Okay. Yeah, I think that's really helpful because some people, their approach is like, well, if we can just get prove to people that the Bible is the Word of God, then, well, we've got him. If you believe the Bible is the Word of God, then everything else falls into place. What are your thoughts on that sort of approach?
Well, I think that does work for some people. It doesn't work for everyone, though. And I think, again, the apologist needs to be open to various approaches. And for me, one very important way is to, in effect, help people to see that you cannot prove that any worldview is right. There's always going to be ambiguity. So you say, right, let's get used to that. Let's ask which is the best, which makes most sense, which, here's a very important point, which gives us the best way of living, which helps us to understand who we really are, which brings us hope. And Christianity is really brilliant in all those ways.
So, what are your thoughts then on the use of the Bible in apologetics? I mean, some schools of thought, when it comes to evangelism, it's like you got to constantly, verse after verse, it's all got to be scripture focused. My experience is that that's not the best place, but to start from the place of what people already understand.
I think people very often find it unhelpful to have lots and lots of biblical quotations thrown at them. I think that this doesn't really work for them. But what you can do is in effect use a slightly different approach. And I've used this a lot. I think this works. I'll say, look, Jesus talked about parables. One of the parables he tells is about the pearl of great price, finding something that is deeply satisfying, that really brings you hope and joy. And that actually is a way of thinking about the Christian faith. It's something really significant. It's very expensive, yes, but it brings hope, it brings joy. And the good news is it's given to us. It's a gift. So what we tend to do is use scripture to illustrate, to kind of use narratives or sometimes phrases from Paul's letter and open them up. And so in other words, if you like, it's drawing aside the curtain, let people see what is there and getting them to think, I'd like to know more about that. So if you like, it's a sort of exploratory approach, which is saying there's so much for you to find there. Let me just explore a few things with you and then invite you to kind of go further on your own.
All right. Okay, back to some of these individuals. So you did a section on Francis Schaeffer. I remember growing up in an evangelical church back in the 80s when I was a baby Christian. Francis Schaeffer was a very big name then. So what are his contributions to apologetics?
Well, Schaeffer is still very, very significant. I think that his greatest insight is that all worldviews have presuppositions, and some of those presuppositions don't stand up to critical analysis. And Schaeffer is very, very good at putting his finger on the weak points in somebody's worldview. And that, I think, is very, very important. I mean, Schaeffer's used quite a lot by Tim Keller, who I think is one of our best recent apologists. And in effect, what Keller does is exactly what Schaeffer does, which is to say, you believe this, but your belief rests on a set of presuppositions, and look at them. Some of them are rather, frankly, very weak. You need to be able to critique people's presuppositions, and that helps these people to realize that actually their own way of thinking rests on rather inadequate foundations. So that's very important. I mean, for me, Schaeffer is better as a critic of other people's worldviews than as a defender of Christianity. But hey, I mean, there are lots of things we can do, and Schaeffer's very, very good at doing that, and it needs to be done.
All right, and then Charles Taylor. So if you could say a little about who he was and then more about his approach to apologetics.
Charles Taylor is a Canadian philosopher who is very, very interested in the question of how a secular age came about and what it means. And Taylor is very, very good at explaining why Western culture has changed the way it did, and hence how we can engage with it and begin to raise questions about where it's going. Now, the quality of his analysis is very, very good. I mentioned a moment ago Tim Keller, and Tim Keller uses Charles Taylor quite a lot. And he uses him to, in effect, help explain how our present situation has come about and show how it can be changed. That, in effect, secularism isn't inevitable. It's just something that is persuasive to some people at some times, and other options are available. So I find Charles Taylor really very helpful in understanding how we've got to where we are and what we can do in this present moment to help people realize that Christianity has this ability to engage human minds and human hearts in ways that secularism actually can't do. So I think he's a very interesting writer. He may be difficult for you to read at first hand. So therefore you might want to read someone like, I mentioned um, Tim Keller already. I mean, he's very, very good explaining why Taylor is very, very good. So there are lots of ways you can get into this.
Could you give a few more details in about Taylor's thought?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that Taylor talks about is finding the best explanation. Now, again, that's very similar to thinking about the natural sciences. Taylor uses the phrase best account. Again, best account a lot. And he's saying that we've got to find the best account of who we are and what life is all about. So he's moving away from a scientific theory to a sort of almost like a worldview. But the key point he's making is you need to find that best account of life because that brings you meaning and significance. And frankly, Taylor is saying there are an awful lot of ways of thinking which do not help you answer these questions at all. And Christianity is really good at doing that. So that's certainly a very important theme he develops.
All right. So though you don't cover the controversial issue regarding creation and evolution in the book, it's still an important issue for apologetics. And since you have a strong scientific background, what are your thoughts on that controversy?
Well, I think it is a controversy for a lot of people, particularly in North America. I think what I would want to say is that I think Alvin Plantinga, the philosopher, is probably right when he says that the real issue actually isn't so much between creation and evolution. It's whether evolution is a godless, directionless process where God's not involved. I think in many ways that for him, that's the key issue. Because in my own case, I'm a scientist. I can accept the idea of biological evolution. And actually, I read the book of Genesis in ways that, resonate with that. It's a very long-standing tradition. It goes way back to the 5th century of Augustine of Hippo, who said, look, to read Genesis, to read about an instantaneous moment of creation, and then a period of development as the earth brought forth different kinds of living things. But I think for me, the important thing is to say that creation versus evolution, I mean, I don't necessarily see these as being alternatives. You can weave them together very, very well. I think the important thing is that all of us have to work out what we think about this. And I can easily tell you what I think, but there are several landing points that you can arrive at. But for me, the key thing is to be able to say to people that the complexity of our world is really best explained by a creator God who made the world and us. So that's what I would say very briefly to that good question.
So the atheistic evolutionists would say that random mutations took place over billions of years and eventually gave us all these various life forms, right? But to me, and then others would say there's just not enough time. Obviously, yes, random mutations, but creating whole radically different kinds of animals, that's unlikely. There's not enough time for that. So God would have had to intervene. There would have had to be something of God that was moving this evolution project forward besides random mutations. How would you answer that question?
Well, I would say that evolutionary theory is changing as we begin to appreciate how complicated things are. So we have to be careful not to lock ourselves into a discussion based on, well, for example, a book like Richard Dawkins' book, Selfish Gene, which is now very, very out of date. I think we don't fully understand this process, but what I would want to say is that there are different models that Christians can adopt. You can be a sort of young earth creationist, you can be an old earth creationist, you can be a theistic evolutionist, you can be an intelligent design person. Each of these have strengths, each of them have weakness. And the point I'd want to make is that everyone listening to me will find their way to a particular way of thinking that they think this is the best account, to use Charles Taylor's phrase. In my case, I kind of think you can bring evolution and divine creation together quite nicely. But, not everyone thinks like that. But the point is there are options, there are ways of thinking about this. And I would say to those listening to me, look, check them out and see which one you think is the one that you feel happiest with.
Well, but for you personally, how would you describe, would you say it was inherent within the original creation, even at the Big Bang, that these species had this, that by nature they would evolve, that this is a seed, or it's something that God moved along, that God intervened to change each species to, a whole different kind. That's
well, they could both be right. I mean, let me take a good example, which is Augustine of Hippo, an early Christian writer. And in his commentary on Genesis, written in 401, what Augustine says is that God implants certain templates, if you like, in the world, which actually are what we're going to become. And under God's divine providence, we see this process enacting. So if you like, there's something built into the structures of creation, but there's also God's supervening providence bringing these things about. So if you like, he's kind of weaving these two together. And more interestingly, he sees these in the book of Genesis, which is really interesting.
So what are your thoughts on the fossil record that even atheistic paleontologists will say, we just don't have the evidence of these transitional species in the fossil record?
Well, the fossil record is complex, but it does make it very clear, I think, that life forms that were clearly existent at one point are so no longer. But there are many areas that we still don't fully understand. My own feeling is that what you see is a number of trajectories developing. The one that brings us to being is clearly the most significant of these.
Okay, so do you think that it is a problem that we're missing transitional species in the fossil record?
Well, I don't think this is the right place in which to go into this in detail, because it's going to require a lot of comment. But what I would say is that the fossil record is there. It's open to various interpretations. Think of, for example, the divergence between Richard Dawkins and Stephen Jay Gould on this point. But for me, one of the most important points really is it brings home to us that there's a history which brings us to where we are. And actually understanding that history, I think, does give us a better sense of who we are and where we've been.
Okay. And then I'm really interested in where your own interests are now. What are you passionate about learning, about researching, about writing? I mean, beyond apologetics or even theology, what's really on your heart?
I think what's on my heart is to try and reconnect with people who describe themselves as being religious nuns. Because what I found is that when I talk to people like this, very often there's a story about how they came to be religious nuns. And very often the reason they will say, I don't have any religious faith, is because they've had a bad experience, or very, very commonly because they haven't really understood their faith properly. They had false expectations. They didn't really understand things very, very well. One of my passions is really to say, is there something we can do to kind of help pastors and preachers to prepare Christians for these questions and to, in effect, help them to grow in their faith so that they're not simply able to avoid this problem themselves, but are able to help those who are having these problems. So for me, if you like, the rise of this category of religious nuns really is, in one sense, very exciting, because it means we've got a new audience to engage. I think it's very, very important. But what I want to say is all the resources we need are there. And it's going to be very exciting making sure we can develop these properly.
So that's really apologetics for Christians then?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, for me, one of the lessons I've learned down the years is apologetics is not just about reaching beyond the church. It's also about reaching inside the church. People who come to faith with unsolved questions, or people who come to church, in effect, thinking maybe this will help me sort out these doubts I have. So you need to be aware in your congregations, you can do apologetics. You need to do apologetics because you need to help people to either grow in their faith or sometimes even come to faith.
So maybe for a lot of people, it was something emotional, something social, or they had addictions, serious problems in their life, and they sensed a need for God, but they didn't realize the intellectual genius of Christianity. And as they grew in their learning, they might have read somebody like Dawkins and then get confused and don't realize the depth of the intellectual part of Christianity.
Well, that's right. I mean, people come to faith for lots of reasons. Sometimes it's an overwhelming experience of God. Sometimes it's reading scripture. Sometimes it's talking to their Christian friends. But whatever the entry door is for us, we need to grow. It's not just enough to say, I had this wonderful experience of God. You need to, in effect, understand what Christianity is all about. So wherever the entry door is, there's a big landscape of faith to explore, and you need to really take it all in because it's so wonderful.
So we should expect a book on this topic for you then?
Maybe one day, maybe.
Okay. So are you working on any particular books right now?
I'm working on a book on why belief is normal, and trying to challenge people like Richard Dawkins to say, no, you only accept what you can prove. Now, I'm just saying the reality is all the big questions in life you can't prove. Get used to it. And that includes his atheism. So that will come out hopefully in the next year or so.
So Dawkins has certainly been very useful in stimulating Christians to work on their apologetics.
He certainly has. And I think that in many ways, Dawkins has raised questions he can't answer. A friend and I edited a book recently called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. And it's about 12 individuals who began thinking, hey, Richard Dawkins is great. And then discovered it was awful and found their way to Christianity instead, coming to faith through Dawkins. Amazing, isn't it?
Okay, I should check that out. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to end there. So I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Alister McGrath, and we're taking a look at his book, Christian Apologetics, an Introduction. So follow the link below, check out the book. Dr. McGrath, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure and privilege. Thank you for having me.
Okay, peace to everyone. I'd love to hear from you. Please email me at thecharge.info@gmail.com. Please check out our other videos. Don't forget to hit like and click subscribe.